Hello? Hello? This is One Spooked Professor, and if you're hearing this, either I've made it back and I maybe put it into some sort of podcast or something, or, well, I haven't, and have published it as a warning or some sort of posthumous note. Well, today I'd like to focus on apocalyptic logs before that thing comes and finds me like it did all the others. Maybe you can use that knowledge the next time you find an apocalyptic log to avoid what happened to us. There's actually a long history of apocalyptic logs in my life that made a mark. I'll always remember the diary in the original Resident Evil game, the one where we get to read the words of a man as he degenerates into a zombie. Itchy, tasty, those were the last words of it. It was so simple, but effective. I've seen creepypastas try and copy it. This one really weirded me out as a kid, and yes, I was a kid when I played that game. I think I was maybe 10, 11. Hey, I saw Alien a couple years before I hit double digits, so this is not the first thing to make me not want to sleep in the dark. Most of the lore in that game came in the form of apocalyptic logs. The main character's arrival after the shit had already gone down, and they're having to survive in what was left, that was the majority of the game. But to figure out what happened there, you had to go to those apocalyptic logs. The same thing could occur if any of you visited Rapture, at least the logs of those who were already dead or had gone mad. That's enough to qualify, I suppose. In many of these video games, it saved on animation, increased that sense of isolation and foreboding, and it stopped Capcom from writing any more truly abysmal dialogue. For all of the sandwich fans out there, you know what I'm talking about. Apocalyptic logs are stories, often presented as notes, a diary, or recording of events or of characters' thoughts before something really bad happens to them. Or happened to them. After all, we're looking into the past. Sometimes this goes to the ridiculous extreme of a person literally riding up to the moment of their death, like they don't have any more immediate concerns than the crocodile eating them. The audio and visual versions of this can often include the person's death at the very end. There are even songs that include the character's death at the end that, in certain circumstances, fit the bill as apocalyptic logs. Or, in very bizarre cases, a podcast and YouTuber might fake an apocalyptic log to talk about apocalyptic logs. Imagine that stupid-ass idea. That's cringy. Almost Jeff the Killer level cringy. Okay, maybe that's too cringy, but still, pretty cringy, and quite possibly full of overacting. Apocalyptic logs are a form of narrative... Hang on. Okay, it's not here. That was something else. Narrative framing device made special by the foreboding nature of the author having met their doom during or after the writing of said material. A person who was writing about what it felt like to be eaten by a snake while being eaten by a snake would qualify, though considering how constrictors act, one big enough to eat you would have killed you and constricted you to the point where you couldn't write long before you made it into the snake itself. Narrative framing devices are about as common as zombies in a Romero film. The majority of the film 300 comes in the frame of a story told by the one Spartan survivor as he spins type of wartime propaganda. Iron Man 3 is basically Tony Stark talking to a napping Bruce Banner. The Princess Bride takes place in the context of a storybook read by a grandfather to his grandson. A large portion of Ambrose Bierce's occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge happens in the mind of a man being hung. So on and so forth. Framing devices create a context through which we get this story, and the apocalyptic log has a special place in horror, in no small part to its darker nature, and its warnings of doom and death, and, well, I suppose that's how horror goes. So much so, it is incredibly common in short horror stories and novellas. H.P. Lovecraft lived and breathed apocalyptic logs, and if you consider his writings during his death, actually wrote a real one. Stephen King is not exactly scared to roll out with some of these himself. Hell, Frankenstein could be considered one. It's a sort of narrative framing device for an entire story sometimes, like the Blair Witch Project, or for many narratives within a larger one, with the log creating a context to bring in additional information, maybe even facilitate a flashback. Not all apocalyptic logs make their home in horror works. Obviously, the important elements of doom and death are still there for it to be an apocalyptic log. After all, if someone survives the writing of this and then goes on to have a long, full, happy life, it wasn't an apocalyptic log. Nor is simply the idea that someone is dead enough reason to make an apocalyptic log just that. The log must be in some way, shape, or form tied to their doom, imminent or otherwise. Take the apocalyptic log from the boat in Frozen. This is an example of a family film that contains said apocalyptic log from the doomed parents of the two sisters. Of course, that example is super brief, and it's really just a note scribbled onto a map. WALL-E has one too. There's a MASH episode with the girl who walked into a minefield and blew up, and people are trying to figure out, what was she like? We need to talk about her at the funeral. And they eventually go to her diary that precedes her death. Most of these examples of non-horror apocalyptic logs focus on the tragedy that came after the log was written. Now, if we are dealing with a horror work, we may step beyond that tragedy into the more foreboding things that it can set up. Scares, the building of tension, the call of madness, perhaps even the doom of the reader. There are many internet stories you can find in creepypastas where even hearing the story dooms the reader. Pay no attention to the fact that some people make copies of evil tapes and pass them on to others to avoid issues. Now, it is possible for an apocalyptic log to be uplifting. One can be seen in Star Trek Voyager, when they get the video logs of a dead explorer who chose to sacrifice his life support to keep the imagers going to capture more and more knowledge of the galaxy for future people who found his corpse, inspiring Seven of Nine, who up to that point disagreed with Captain Janeway's explorer mindset, to see the value of humanity's will to explore the unknown. What can be made known of the unknown, and what can be made more mysterious because of narrative distance, are the core uses of the apocalyptic log in horror storytelling. Let's start with making known of the unknown. Logs left behind by the doomed and the damned can shed light on parts of a narrative the protagonist was not around for, or for some reason could not experience. An example of this can be found in Dawn of the Dead as an extra on the DVD, where we get videos in a sort of diary made by Andy, the gun shop owner. He's someone we meet in the film, but we largely don't see what he goes through, and the diary entry answers many of the questions that the audience may have for him, like, why didn't you just try shooting all those zombies? Watching him slowly degenerate in the absence of people and due to starvation, including eating his little fish friends, shows us the personal horror of experiencing a zombie outbreak without really showing a zombie on screen until the very end, and he becomes one himself. This allows us to experience a new side of the horror, while giving us information that can help our own experience of the film itself, illuminating things that we didn't get to experience because he was not one of our primary protagonists. In video games, this is often an important tool for setting up the scenario you're in. The Resident Evil example I used at the beginning shows you exactly what went down, or at least something of what went down at the Spencer estate, so that you can slowly begin to piece together why a mansion in the woods would have zombies. Every Resident Evil game has these. If you want to figure out what was going on at that village in Resident Evil 4, well, some of your enemies actually had diaries. Although those diaries became sort of apocalyptic because of what you did to them, but hey, that is something that Resident Evil 4 gets to hold above you. Yep, I shot this guy. Maybe I was talking a little too loud. It's okay, I'm still here. I am still here. Not eaten. And not like the others. Anyway, it's not the only one to try this. There are a lot of dystopian stories like the one I mentioned in Rapture, where you get to hear about the horrors that befell the sunken city. Well, not sunken so much as underwater. Sunken city would be more akin to Atlantis, don't you think, than a dystopia that was meant to be underwater for its own safety and isolation. Maybe I'm just talking to myself and debating semantics here, but that's how I'd view it anyway. Often these apocalyptic logs can inform us as to the motivations of characters who don't pause to tell them to you, so you can skip a speech, or show us the humanity of characters who don't otherwise demonstrate that in the moment, or even show us parts of a world that no longer exists, like in Last of Us or any other example of a apocalyptic work, in which case it literally becomes an apocalyptic log. Sometimes even when the apocalyptic log is the body of the story, the main focus of it, as in the case of The Damned Thing, another Ambrose Bierce work. He was not one of the happiest writers of his generation, it would seem. He certainly wrote a lot of dark things. Well, in The Damned Thing, you have us begin with a inquest over a dead man, and the submission of the man's journal. From there, you learn that this man was living in the woods with some creature that you could not see. And it was through that log we got to experience the horror of being stalked by such a monster, and its nature. This is what gave us the answer to our mystery, if the words of this man who lived in the woods could be trusted. And indeed, that leads us to the opposite, or at least different, use of the apocalyptic log, and this is to create a sense of the unknown. After all, if you have an unreliable narrator or a limiting perspective, what would be easily visible if you were there in person can be obscured. Was there really a witch in the original Blair Witch? We don't know, because the very nature of the camera made it a mystery. Unreliable narrators in works like The Yellow Wallpaper can make it very unclear if she was tearing down the wallpaper or flaying her own skin off of her body. We don't know, because the narrator doesn't make it quite clear. And indeed, that was an interpretation I found very interesting, much more horrifying, and her husband's reaction to seeing her becomes much more understandable if she was tearing at her skin instead of just the wallpaper. But maybe I'm getting into weird theories there. Madness is a key tool of mystery when it comes to these examples, because after all, if you're writing something down, the only insight we get into it is what the person chose to write down. So if you're twisted, if you're forgetful, if you're fixated, everything else becomes the unknown. And if you have listened to my other lectures, the unknown is where we can hide monsters. Obscure their origins, obscure their nature, obscure their weaknesses. The unknown breeds fear. And the unknown is perhaps our greatest source of terror in general. So while a log could be a source of information, it could also be a source of misinformation or of merely limited information, things that cause you to wonder and fear and make thoughts fester rather than calm you down. Either way, the contents of the log can be used to create both tension and some degree of understanding of the stakes. After all, if characters have already faced these things and died or gone crazy, you know what could happen to you. You also can set up creatures that you haven't seen. Goblins in Moria, for example. Or, of course, certain types of monsters with very long tongues. These sorts of setups can in many ways make the eventual reveal that much more horrifying or memorable. It's one thing to simply see a monster. It's another to know it's coming and know little bits and pieces about it that make it all the more terrifying and have to slowly build up to its reveal. Maybe even giving you a glimpse of it before that main encounter, such as with the rather famous Pyramid Head. Before we get to that moment of horror, apocalyptic logs can even be plot-moving MacGuffins, such as in the case of the Firefly-based film Serenity, where the apocalyptic log that explains the origin of the Reapers becomes the tool that the main characters use to expose the Alliance's many crimes. So not only did it inform us of a monster's origin, create a scenario where we built up tension through a sobbing woman's speech to her eventual horrific murder, but we also used that to create the climax of the film, making it the MacGuffin the main characters had to deliver, and the MacGuffin that the antagonist had to destroy. Sometimes these apocalyptic logs can be combined with other elements to create a mystery that you can solve. An example of this can be found in Dragon Age Inquisition, where there is a lover's note that forms the basis of one of the game's quests in a forested area. Now, by that point in the game, I had largely checked out because there was so much grinding. But eventually I noticed well, let's just say I worked backwards from the logic and realized the real horror of the situation. You see, you can go to the location where the lovers were to meet up, and instead of finding people, a giant spider emerges and tries to eat you. And if you loot the spider, there is evidence that you were not its first victim. And the horror of the context clue combined with the letter makes this little side quest all the more, well, interesting. And that is good interaction between an apocalyptic log and the actual story itself. Sometimes these little clues can just be thrown out there to create tension, and in many cases fall flat. An example of this can be seen in the movie Doom, the one with The Rock, where there is an apocalyptic log of people screaming to build tension, but it really doesn't necessarily do much of anything since the energy goes right back down. And it's never really referenced again. So, nice try there. But if you can build it up and combine it with context clues that allow us to make leaps in logic that connect it, your audience might find a sense of reward in that. Making those connections allows us to solve a little sort of mystery, and the reward is often more terror. But sometimes the mystery can serve other purposes, and the context clues are supposed to lead you to an answer, as in the case of creepily themed mystery rooms or escape rooms. Yes, I think escape rooms is the proper term, not mystery rooms. It's getting a little claustrophobic in here, I hope you understand. I should probably continue on. Apocalyptic logs are also a useful tool for toying with the very fabric of a reader or viewer's perception of reality. After all, most stories can only exist because of a suspension of disbelief. And the apocalyptic log in this case can become a facilitator of said suspension of disbelief, or try and obscure the idea that this thing was really fiction to begin with. There is a primary example of this with the Cannibal Holocaust, a found footage film that really popularized the genre and laid its groundwork. Now, the Blair Witch Project is what brought it to widespread mainstream attention, but Cannibal Holocaust is the genre's formative film. The Cannibal Holocaust was so successful in creating this realistic depiction of its hellscape of a jungle world where the main characters were killed that the director actually had to bring his actors to court to prove that he had not murdered them, and indeed to facilitate this illusion that there was some sort of reality to this found footage film. The actors were contractually forbidden from appearing in public or taking other jobs for a certain amount of time. And since the Blair Witch Project came out when I was fairly young, I can tell you that there were actually school children my age, old enough to be evil, think you know everything, and yet be ignorant at the same time. Many of those people were arguing whether or not the Blair Witch was actually real, and they would use it to scare others. Perhaps some really believed it, perhaps others were just seeing it as a tool. Although since the internet would also become more and more open throughout my childhood, there would often be real horror you could show people by video. Let us not talk about the two female subjects who happened to have a cup. Let us forget that was ever a thing and purge it from memory. Please. Found footage films do create that suspension of disbelief or facilitate it, or in some way give you a plausible reason to buy into it, through the idea that this footage has been uncovered and you're trying to see what happened to these people or solve the mystery. All sorts of different ways to get to the same result. Create a scary tale, generate a mystery that leads to unease, that leads to tension, which can eventually result in the scare. And, naturally enough, enjoying the whole process. And watching the person next to you cover their eyes, scream, and not enjoy it. That's particularly fun. This sort of narrative tool can also give rhyme or reason to a tale that would otherwise remain a mystery. Would you know that the T-virus was spread throughout Raccoon City by rats if we hadn't seen the footage of the Umbrella team taking it from Birkin and then getting slaughtered, only for rats to spread it to the water supply? It's not something that our characters were there for, so we were able to give context to the event. It provides a plausible explanation for why the plot happened. It can also even be the catalyst in and of itself, as seen with the Evil Dead series, where an apocalyptic recording and the Necronomicon lead to a bunch of, can we say, bad things involving hands, trees, and headless girlfriends. It's an overall pleasant experience. I'd advise you go check that one out. Hopefully I'll get the chance to do so myself. Note that not every diary entry written by someone now dead is an apocalyptic log. Otherwise, virtually every piece of literature written by someone not here would be considered such, and the trope namer and genre would not have any meaning. And trust me, it's important for our tropes not to be overused, overextended, or forgotten and made useless by any of the means I've just described, in no small part because it doesn't like that. One of the others, they were overusing the manic pixie dream girl trope, mentioning that any female character with some sort of unique trait was a manic pixie dream girl pretty much by definition. He was the first to go. Respect the tropes, otherwise it might find you. No, for something to be truly qualified as an apocalyptic log, there must be some link between the log itself and the imminent demise, doom, or madness of the character. Some line of strong correlation, perhaps direct causation, that frames it as such. Otherwise, the term means nothing. The apocalyptic logs can often overlap with other tropes. Sometimes the apocalyptic log will double as a distress call that might turn out to be a warning all too late, as in the case of the Nostromo. Sometimes it will come in the form of a wounded, dying person, a video log, a recording, sometimes literally penned by an undead author who experienced it himself and is now letting you know how he or she or it went. Or even in the form of some posthumous narration given at the beginning or end of a film. Or a "this is the last entry of such and such log." Could even come in the form of the message in the bottle. In the end, though, if you're dealing with this trope, you should consider what use you can put it to, especially as an author, or as a creator of some kind, maybe a filmmaker even. What can the apocalyptic log do for you that some other trope cannot? Keep in mind that you want the audience to be there for as many experiences as possible. We're there for the experience. It's not Greek drama where all the interesting things happen off stage. You want us to be there for the horror, unless of course it ruins the mystery that you need, or isn't for some temporal reason possible. And you need to give circumstances a chance to grow before the main character arrives for the horror to reach its maximum potential. After all, coming to a horribly destroyed and twisted base in the Arctic, previously run by Norwegians and survived only by a dog that, strangely enough, some of them were trying to kill, well, that can certainly set up some scares to come later, and maybe even form the basis of a much less entertaining and successful film that will serve as an unneeded prequel. View this trope, like you do any other, as a tool for you to use. And in many ways, its method of scare works exactly like all of the others that we have discussed, and falls into our definitions of horror that were set down in the very first episode. You have that build-up and the fear of the unknown. Then you have the actual encounter with the horror itself, the being that is hunting them. Perhaps it is a evil, demented entity hiding as a clown. And then sometimes there is just the gross out that comes afterwards, more trying to shock or entertain than scare. Apocalyptic logs can contain all three, but should modify how you attempt to use them. As you've seen, mystery is an important component of the apocalyptic log, so the terror and its ability to build up that terror, both in the log itself at its end, or after a character has put the log down, is perhaps one of the most useful components of the apocalyptic log. But the log itself can contain the horror and even the gross out just as well, especially if the person making it doesn't make it to the end or describes truly terrible things. And indeed, I've found that some apocalyptic logs rearrange these. An example of this can be seen in Code Veronica, where you get the doctor's log. You are not exactly slowly introduced to his madness. He's a sadist, and he describes what horrible things he has done to the patients on this island, slowly showing you what exactly went on at Rockford, while also giving you the gross-out details like sewing glass into wounds. These two combine to lead to one of two effects. Either you get the explanation before you kill the doctor and thus you meet the horror in person and know its backstory, or you have already killed it and get an explanation of why it was even more terrible than you had just experienced, building up either way to show you why this wider world of horror that is Rockford Island should not be underestimated and something you should fear. These multiple apocalyptic logs in certain materials can be used to create a wider narrative, or be the framework for that entire narrative itself, depending on what you want that story to do. Either way, I suggest you consider its utility. Anyway, I'm going to try and make it out of here. This is maybe the best chance I've got. And, well, thank you for listening. Have a nice day, everyone. Bye.